Okay, so we're going to demonstrate how an ability to adduct a hip, so to cross a femur across the midline of a pelvis, which is an important part of gait and an important part of life in general, is not related to an IT band, and that feelings of IT band tension and or tightness are not resolved by attempting to stretch it. It's actually not a tissue that can be stretched, but actually an ability to adduct a hip is related to the alignment of the hips, not to a shortness or lack of extensibility of a piece of connective tissue. So I have a client here who is demonstrating a positive Ober's test, and our Ober's test is this side-lying test. So if I ask you to lay on your side here, so the Ober's test is this side-lying adduction test, where we see if a femur, a thigh bone, can adduct, can cross the midline of a pelvis. So really, can I get a knee down to a table? And I see that I can't. That would be a positive Ober's test. Ober's test is named after a surgeon, Ober's, who used to conduct surgery on IT bands. And if you were demonstrating a positive Ober's test, the solution or resolution was to actually cut into the IT band to allow that action to happen. We know a little bit more than that these days. There is a school of thought that talks about trying to stretch pieces of tissue. The IT band actually isn't a piece of tissue that you can stretch or that you can release in any way. It's a very thick, very sturdy piece of connective tissue. Now, what we do know now is that an inability to adduct a hip is more related to the alignment of the hips than any piece of tissue. So starting to try and pull and poke and prod on bits of tissue and roll on them and vibrate things onto them is actually more likely to cause us pain and bruising than it is anything else. So if we come back onto our back, we also will quite often see a corresponding lack of internal rotation on a hip that we can't adduct. So internal rotation on this hip we're seeing 10 degrees or so, whereas internal rotation on the other side we're kind of seeing more like 45 degrees. Now, if we do a little exercise to try and improve the alignment of the hip, so if I ask you to push your heels into the, not so much, so just push the heels into the table, just so that the pelvis tilts around about here. Then I'm going to ask you to take this foot off and just straighten that leg. All right, so I just want some activity through that hamstring here. Just drop down just a tiny bit. All right, hold that position there and just take some deep breaths. So deep breath in through the nose and a full exhale. So what I'm doing here is actually using the tension of the hamstring to pull that pelvis into a more favorable position, and I'm using breath to make sure that the diaphragm and therefore hip flexors are not adding to any tension in there as well. So I'm just making sure that the diaphragm is moving freely. Right, if I ask you just to relax and then move back onto your right hand side, so roll back onto your right hand side, and then we repeat this Ober's test, we can see that we can now cross the midline of the pelvis. I can get the knee down to the table pretty comfortably without any resistance at all. So that is no longer a positive Ober's test, and that would be somebody who in days gone by would be a candidate for surgery by Mr. Ober's, or in more recent times a candidate to have a piece of fibrous tissue poked and prodded and rolled on and vibrated. What we actually needed to do was just a little bit of activity to help pull that pelvis back into line. So if we come back onto our back, we should also see that that lack of internal rotation has resolved as well, because both of those apparent changes or apparent lacks of movement or range of movement were actually nothing to do with tissue. They were nothing to do with anything being too short or too tight, but everything to do with bones not being lined up the way that we would like them to. So our solution to that is to think about what's attached to those bones, turn some things on to pull those bones to the position that we want, and then movement will clean up.